Hello, BookTube. We're down here in puppy territory for an unexpected book tour. I am still going to continue with my book tour of the Penguin Classic wall, but I'm still pondering. We had that weird annex bookcase that had no organization whatsoever and all sorts of miscellaneous books. I pulled them all off and they're on the floor. So I'm still pondering what I want to do, how I want to arrange that, but I got in the habit. I kind of like doing bookshelf tours. And it occurs to me that there are a whole bunch more of you than there were the last time I went over any of these books. In fact, I'm not sure I went over any of these particular books before. So I thought we'd just do a quick impromptu book tour here in Frida's neck of the woods. Yes, we're down here with you. See it, people? Yes. Anyway, now that the requisite smooching is over, we'll just do one shelf for today, and it looks like it's all history. So those of you who are interested in history might want to open that Goodreads tab that you have that has my name on it. The first one is a classic, The Wise Men. This is by Evan Thomas and Walter Isaacson, Walter Isaacson went on to do a whole string of standalone biographies that became bestsellers. And this is a group biography, which is very difficult to do, of a group of U.S. policymakers in the wake of the Second World War, and especially at the height of the Cold War, who were dubbed informally and somewhat sarcastically the Wise Men. And they are Robert Lovett, John McCloy, Averell Harriman, Charles Bowen, George Kennan, and Dean Acheson. And it actually works. As a collective biography, it actually works. They were friends. Some of them were closer friends than others, but they all knew each other, and they all knew each other intimately over a long period of time. And it's a weird and effective way to do a history of this period. I'd be willing to bet this won't be the only Cold War history that we get on this shelf, but the next one is not. The next one is from Harvard. It's a wonderful trade paperback of The Middle Ages by Johann Freyd that I loved. I thought it was fantastic. And despite the fact that I thought it was fantastic, when the paperback arrived to me, I looked immediately for my hardcover and could not find it. so I'm glad I have the paperback. Then the next one, a historian I have praised on this channel many times. This is The Deluge by Adam Tooze. And this is the long aftermath, socially, politically, militarily, but especially economically, of the First World War. Just amazing stuff. It's just an amazing book. Huge idea realigning insights everywhere, on almost every page. Just it's a tome. It's a big thing. But boy, oh boy, what a historian! What a thrill to have these people like him and Johannes Freyd working in our time, working alive today. It's just a thrill for me anyway. And the next one is a lot of fun. This is Nigel Hamilton's American Caesars, in which he does the lives of American presidents, from Theodore Roosevelt to George W. Bush, and he does them in the title American Caesars. He does them in the way of Suetonius' Lives of the Caesars. So let me get you an example here. So we have Lyndon Johnson, later reviled, but that changes. Like, for instance, Johnson's predecessor, John F. Kennedy, is later deified. And it's just pocket biographies of all of these different presidents. Amazingly good stuff. It's as bracing as Suetonius. Hamilton obviously has his eye on that model the whole time. And of course, I read with special attention the Kennedy part, because not only do I read all things Kennedy, but also Hamilton was famous for drawing the ire of the Kennedy family with his big volume about the youth of John F. Kennedy. That was supposed to be the first volume in a trilogy, and it was squashed because it was not unflattering. It was just the portrait of the callow youth of a second son, someone who didn't, at the time that the book was concerned with, expect to be the leader of anything, much less the free world. This is, if you encounter it and you're interested in American presidents, this is a hoot. Just a hoot. And what's next here? Oh, great. Oh, fantastic. Look at this lovely volume. the bully pulpit. This is Doris Kearns Goodwin. It's just amazingly well done. She just gets better and better. Her latest book is one of those, that crop of books that American historians are lunging to the publishers with, about American values and the sanctity of American public life and how we're all not going to die. But her serious works of history are amazingly good. And this one, as you can see from the cover, is in large part about the epic rift between lifelong friends, Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, that split their party and handed the election to Woodrow Wilson, and was the only subject that most American journalists could even talk about for the better part of a year. Not so much the damage it was doing to the party, not so much the political aftermath, as the personal. This was one of the highest profile breakups in American history, and it never fully healed, as such things never do. But the thing that I loved about this book is that although it's in large part about that, it's also in large part about the journalists. It revives the memory of some of the key journalists of the age, and tells their stories through in largely hugely generous quotes from their own work. That's wonderful. That's something we too often forget. We wouldn't know much about the Taft-Roosevelt split if it weren't for those journalists. We lose track of how much journalists writing, their so-called first drafts of history actually contribute to history. And this book brings that all back. It's just the amount of research, the digging in that must have been done to find out the personal lives and details of some of these people. And then to craft it all into a terrific read. Let's see, what's next? Crossroads for Liberty. Oh, I think I remember this. Yes, this is William Watkins. This is done by Independent Institute. I got it, I think, from the publisher. Yeah, I got it from the publisher. It's Crossroads for Liberty, and it's recovering the anti-federalist values of America's first Constitution, meaning the Articles of Confederation. This is a book about the evils of federalism, with which I agree completely. I agree completely with the evils of federalism. I agree completely with the anti-federalist papers. And, oh my God, nothing irritates me more than for current political and historical pundits to just offhandedly mention how completely flawed the Articles of Confederation were as a document of government. What chaos would have resulted if how could anyone have ever thought it was a good idea that, of course, they needed to be not only amended, but completely scrapped, which is what the Constitutional Convention did without telling anyone that that's what it was doing. When that's totally wrong. That is almost totally wrong. The Articles of Confederation were an original document. They were a first try. They would, of course, have been amended and fixed by compromise and discussion and extension over time, probably large amounts in very quick order. On paper, there are flaws. They would have been fixed in short order. And they would have rectified or prevented some of the evils of federalism, which all of the anti-federalists at the time pointed out, and which you can see today in full bloom. Where is the federal government? It's not a place. It's an abstraction. I don't know anybody that lives in the federal government, and neither do you. They work there, and then they go home to where they live. But where they live is where they pay their taxes. Where they live is where their politicians are accountable. Where they live is where their pipes run with clean water or don't. And where they live is infinitely less bribable. If you make a federal system an overarching government that has complete and dictatorial power over you with almost no representation, then you're swapping out one kind of monarchy for another. That is what the anti-federalists argued, that we just got rid of a super centralized, massively indifferent conglomeration of power over our lives. Why would we set up another one? And the argument that was made, among other people, the hero of Broadway, Alexander Hamilton, was that without that kind of centralization, you wouldn't have a country. But we don't know that because it wasn't tried. This is a full-throated defense of anti-federalism. So it was a joy to read. It doesn't make any sense. I won't lecture. The more you centralize government away from people, the more prone to corruption it is, as we can see any day in the American system. The closer you get to the people whose vote can keep you in office or dismiss you from office, the more accountable you get. And the further away from that you get, and the more power you get, and the more money you get pouring in from Dubai, and the more money you get pouring in without any relief at all, or you get people who are put in this federalist governing body who get to make the rules on whether or not they get paid obscene amounts of money from foreign agents. Of course, they're going to make the rules so that they can, instead of so that they can't, and fudge it in the fog of a general crowd, which doesn't happen, and to anywhere near the same extent on the local level. And the Articles of Confederation was designed to create a national government on the local model, and it was scrapped. And you can tell me, historians can tell me, some historians whom you've read have told me over wine, they'd made their best case and said that the reason it was scrapped is because it wasn't workable. That's not true. If you read the Articles of Confederation, you see immediately that state delegates would have changed the parts that didn't work and kept the parts that did, and that the philosophy was workable, far more workable than federalism. And when the wine has been flowing a little more, those historians would say, well, okay, they might have been equally workable, give or take a little, but it was necessary for the country to become a world power. And to that I say, first, no, it wasn't. The engine, the nuclear engine that powered America's rise to world power was capitalism. It was the free market. It was people who are growing pumpkins in their backyard, and they realize, you know, I could grow twice as many pumpkins if I bought my neighbor's backyard and he doesn't use it. So why don't I save enough money to make him an offer? And then you have 2 pumpkin patches, and then you decide, you know, the reaction in the market on Wednesdays and Saturdays to my pumpkins is extremely popular. People like my pumpkins more than they like the pumpkins of other people. I wonder if maybe I should buy 2 more fields, and then 2 more fields. That person soon wants to become the pumpkin king. And that person jostles elbow by elbow, side glance by side glance with other would-be plutocrats every Sunday at church. And that has always been true in America. America is a land of people who want to make it rich. And when you have a system like that, that means that those people will safeguard a system that would make that possible. The Articles of Confederation facilitated that kind of capitalist greed as much as any other organ did, certainly more than the federal government, which set up right away the mechanism for the federal government to put its hand in that pie, that pumpkin pie, in a way that anti-federalist systems would not do. Anyway, we'll move on. We'll move on from there. Aren't you glad that that's not all anti-federalist stuff here? The next one is great. This is Alan Guelzo's 1-volume history of the Battle of Gettysburg. Those of you who are maybe not from America, quite a few of you are not from America, and according to one of my boys, quite a few of the new people to this channel are not from America. I'm sorry I keep mentioning it, but it just boggles my mind that I could have 100 new people in a week. I feel like I should be always addressing the fact that the plenty of new people here haven't watched 2,000 videos or whatever. But one way or another, the Battle of Gettysburg was, during the American Civil War, the Confederacy, the slave states, the traders, made a last-ditch effort to scare the North, scare the United States into some sort of capitulation, into some sort of arbitration, by actually invading instead of constantly working on the defensive. Didn't make any sense at all. Logistically speaking, they were a fraction of their enemy with almost no supplies and constantly on the run and almost completely circled, but hemmed in on many sides. An invasion made no sense at all. And the insanity of the invasion was just compounded by the South's leader, Robert E. Lee, who, for some unaccountable reason, has gone down in history as this military genius. And he once he was on enemy soil and once he accidentally encountered a far larger enemy army, he decided to dig in and fight. Absolute insanity. And those of you who maybe aren't familiar with the details of the Battle of Gettysburg, at the peak of the fight, days in, he not only decided to fight a superior enemy with an infinite supply line behind him on enemy soil, he also decided to march the cream of his army straight across a field and up a low incline at a row of hills where there were mounted gun batteries. First-year cadet at West Point would know not to do that. And Robert E. Lee thought it was a good idea, overruled everyone who said, this is insanity. We will be mowed down like hay. And his forces were mowed down like hay. And they had to retreat. And treasonously, I'm ashamed to say, they were allowed to retreat. The general in charge of the field for the northern forces allowed Lee to withdraw his army. Should have annihilated them down to the last drummer boy. But instead, he didn't. So Lee's army retreated not only from Gettysburg, but from the north. And the war was condemned to months and months and months more slogging and battles. But the battle itself, the days of Gettysburg, has long been recognized as a linchpin in the American Civil War. When something broke, when something fundamental changed. And so it's had many volumes of history, but this is such a good one. Let's see here. Let's see what's now. Oh, okay. All right. I worried about this. We're back to the Cold War. But the Cold War is actually not that far away. Those of you, there's been news articles lately about how the generation that doesn't remember, that wasn't born when 9/11 happened, has now left college and gone into the workforce. They are adults now. But even so, as depressed as that made all my fellow 28-year-olds, you don't have to be that old to remember the Cold War. The Cold War ended in the 90s, almost. So this is Jeffrey Engel. This is When the World Seemed New. George H.W. Bush and the End of the Cold War. Where that's the Berlin Wall coming down. It was on George H.W. Bush's watch that the gigantic hammer blows that had been executed against the tottering Soviet system finally made it fall. And that has caused George H.W. Bush critic, including at the time yours truly, to say that a caretaker president can only be expected not to bungle things at the end. Just don't trip over the rug on your way out the door. Increased hindsight, has shown me that that's not true. There were plenty of ways for the United States, in the person of its president, to have screwed this up, to have done a really bad job with ramifications that we'd probably be feeling today. And George H.W. Bush didn't do any of that. It's no easy thing. Even the finale of a long struggle is no easy thing. All you have to do to hammer that point home is think about how the fall of the Soviet Union would have been handled by, for instance, a more recent occupant of the Oval Office. It took finesse, and it was given finesse. And this book does a wonderful job of that, a wonderful job of those final days. That's just... oh, God. Oh, my God. All right. Okay. Here we go again. This is the End of the Cold War by Robert Service. This is in every way. I mean, I absolutely love Jeffrey Engel's book. I absolutely do. But this is in every way a more magisterial book. This is a work of modern history. One of those works of modern history you really have to have if you're interested in history. This is just a brilliant, sweeping book. I loved it. Of course. I also loved the fact, and I still do, you still see it on this channel almost every week, I love the fact that books like this still appear. I don't know why I would think they wouldn't, but nevertheless, big, serious works. You've got this, you've got this. These things happened in our lifetime. They happened soon, recently. These are big, sweeping, important works of history that are still being published today. They're being published right now. We always think, it'll be something like The Wise Men. It'll be an older, 50-year-old work like The Best and the Brightest or something like that. But no, great books are being done now, and this has everybody. It is a multi-part chorus of a big, complex subject. So I recommend it highly if you're interested in the end of the Cold War. and given current international situations, you probably should be. Fantastic. Dominic Green. This is the double life of Dr. Lopez, who was the Queen's personal physician, who was accused of being a double agent, of being a spy, of being even a would-be poisoner. And the initial backlash against those accusations characterized them as completely spurious. That this was all nothing. That it was made up, basically, by the Earl of by Robert Devereux, by the Earl of Essex. That and his circle. That it was a lot of bother over nothing. And the counter-arguing forces for that point of view pointed out that Queen Elizabeth provided money for Lopez's family after his execution. He was killed for treason. He was executed for treason, and she provided money for his family, and did so without much in the way of commentary. And historians, as their wont, have provided the commentary and said that it was guilt, that she knew he was innocent, either at the time or belatedly realized he was innocent and wanted to make amends somehow. And Dominic Green paints a much more complex picture than that. This is one of those detailed works of history, like we mentioned on this channel the other day, The Reckoning by Charles Nicholl. This is one of those kinds of books, digging in to the details and not taking anything for granted, trying to figure out what this incident was, what its deep roots were, what its documents say, what the most reasonable interpretation is. Thrilling to read. Just thrilling. I remember I had this as a trade paperback for the longest time. My trade paperback, I reread it 3 times, and it started to fall apart. And then just at random, I happened to find a UK hardcover, and gobbled it up. Okay. This next one we saw on this channel in an outside video ages ago. This is the Georgetown Set, about the Alsop brothers. There they are in all their Mandarin glory. Who ruled the society set of Washington in Georgetown for decades, and set the tone and wrote constantly for the public eye and had dinner parties that you'd be ruined if you weren't invited to. I have often talked on this channel of a weird thing, a weird sort of side note to American history that doesn't get its share of attention and probably wouldn't want it either. And that is the Washington social scene. Not now, but in the past, when Georgetown and Washington matrons, when the women, the wives of ambassadors, the wives of senators, conducted this shadow government of dinner parties and salons and reading groups and whatnot, and it was glittering and it was marvelous. And in the hottest days of the year, those of you who have never been to Washington in the summer, oh my God, it's a swamp. You hear in American politics now all the time about draining the swamp, but that comes from the fact that Washington was built on a swamp. Washington City was built on a swamp because it was a killer deal for the land, and rightfully so, because it was a malarial dump. But in high summer in Washington, oh my God, I used to live there, and you just can't believe the heat and humidity. It just during the worst of those months, the social set that I'm talking about at the turn of the 20th century and in the couple of decades afterward was an incredible balm. It was an incredible relief, and lots of stuff got done. The unwritten history of Washington life and American history that happened at those parties, it's extensive. And like any social scene where you've got high-profile invitations going out and you've got lists of who's who and who's where and who's doing what, there was also a poisonous side, and the Alsop brothers represented that poisonous side. I think you can even see it in this picture, but you can certainly see it. You could certainly see it when you spent any time around either one of them. That this was the poisonous aspect of Washington society, but equally fascinating. And this book does a fantastic job of capturing what I wish that there were a book like this for each era of that Washington social set, of those Washington matrons who ran society while their husbands and brothers and uncles and fathers were off at Capitol Hill running the country. There's a history to be made. There's a case to be made that their work was more important, or at least as important. And instead of a single book, I mean, this is an example, and my hat's off to it, but instead of a single book on that I know of, we get book after book after book, little attempts, and also they get represented. They get that world gets reflected in as bits and pieces of other books. You see it in every Washington memoir up until around the 1960s when it started to die. You see it in every Washington memoir, especially early on. You read the letters of Theodore Roosevelt, you'll see that what I'm talking about, that world completely brought to life. And the presidents who tended to fail tended not to partake of that world. And I think that's a one-to-one correspondence. I think it's a fascinating idea. This book comes as close as any to capturing at least many aspects of it. I loved it, but as with all books about Washington life itself, not American history, but Washington life itself, I always wonder what the readership is. I always wonder if the readership is largely composed of people like myself who once experienced it, who once lived there, which has got to be a very small number of people. I'm not sure. A really avid, really smart history buff who grew up in Portland, Oregon, has never been to Washington, D.C., never plans to go to Washington, D.C., certainly is never going to live there. I wonder what such a reader would even make of such a book. I wonder if they'd even notice that it was important. I don't know. It could be a small niche audience, in which case I am a member of that niche audience. Okay, great. This is another UK hardcover. This is I Shall Bear Witness. The diaries from 1933 to 1941 of Victor Klemperer, who kept a diary at the beginning. Just because those of you who keep diaries will know you do. You keep a diary. You just do it. It becomes a reflex, like eating. You feel wrong when you miss a day, and it becomes a great relief. And it was for him in the first probably 6 years of these diaries. It was for him a great relief to come to his diary and try and make sense of the growing chaos of the world around him. This is a man who considered himself German, not Jewish. This is a man who was a citizen, was involved with his neighbors and co-workers and shop owners and the municipal life and the library and the museums, same as you are, same as I am. And then slowly but surely, steadily, grindingly, he and other people the government had decided were enemies started to be excluded from all that and then penalized. So that by the end of this period, by 1941, his diary was not just a relief, but an objective danger. It would have cost him internment in a death camp if it had been known that he was keeping a diary. But along the way here, we see the slow tightening of the noose, and it's just horrifying to have it done day by day like that. It's more horrifying than it is in a historical account, because one day he's bemoaning the fact that there are signs now on shops that are owned by Jews, warning customers that the shop is owned by Jews. And then next week, an edict comes down from the government saying that if you're classified as a Jew or Jewish household by the government, you can't have a pet anymore. And you are to either kill your pet or turn it over to be killed. And in either case, provide documentation that you did so. The government is watching. You can't just say, I don't have a pet, because your house can be searched. You can't just say, I had a cat, but I killed it, because the government will check. They will verify. And the bewilderment and the anger and the helplessness. There's no book like this. I mean, there are many diaries like this, but Klemperer has a very good ear for dramatics, a very good ear for dialogue, and for, like the best diarists, the most inveterate, long habit diarist, he has a really good ear for how to synopsize, what to leave in and what to leave out. It can go wrong. Some diarists, it can go very wrong. They'll pour out their heart about nothing at all, or their entry for the entire week will be "It rained on Monday," and Klemperer never lets either one of those extremes take control. Instead, he's preserving these things for himself, but boy, what a job it does for a reader over his shoulder. Oh my. Let's see here. Oh, this one's big. Oh, great. All right. Well, this is a tough sell. I admit. This is a Remarks, or this is a paperback. This is Writers, Readers, and Reputations: Literary Life in Britain from 1870 to 1918. by Philip Walker. Great big thing that's all about readers, authors, publicists, agents, librarians, everything. This is the whole of the literary world in Great Britain for a huge chunk of essentially the long Edwardian era. Just a huge chunk of British history that gives rise to the modern era. So that by the later parts of each of these chapters, you can see the modern era taking shape. But I mean, Oxford doesn't do itself any favors. Of course, they're not trying to. It's brown. There's a black and white a sketch on the cover. It doesn't look appealing, but boy, is it thrilling. Oh, you wouldn't think so, but it is. If you're, I mean, this is everything. This is the whole world. This is how books were advertised. This is bookish lecture tours. This is book reviewing. That's the main reason that I got it originally, is because there's a huge amount about the world of book reviewing. This is the whole of the literary world for an incredibly productive period of time. I wish there were volumes like this for everything, for every period, every equally long 50-year period of time. I wouldn't give. But anyway, this is... I go back to it all the time. And then we've got this last one. How are we doing for time? Oh, hideously long. All right, well, book tours are hideously long. So we'll do this last one. This is The Intellectual Life of the British Working Class. This is by Jonathan Rose, who's great, and who did a book called The Literary Churchill, I think. That was Jonathan Rose. That was a Churchill book I really liked. This is it's about readers. I mean, it says the intellectual life of the British working class. That really boils down to books, magazines, literary journals, that sort of thing. And I mean, there are other aspects in this book, but it's mostly about readers. So it's a real good companion to writers, readers, and reputation. That's why I always consult them together to see, what the chattering classes were reading and reacting to in 1911 or something like that. And Rose is a fantastic writer. So once again, it's something that I consult all the time. So that was a heavily historical shelf, but it was just a random bookshelf because I felt like talking about books. But I'll wrap this up for now because this is incredibly long. But I'll be back soon. Thank you, BookTube.